Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. In the summer of 1868, a small farming community in Missouri became the setting for one of the most chilling mysteries in American history. It all began with an 8-year-old boy named Timothy Caldwell, who seemed to be a picture of innocence, polite, well-behaved, and seemingly charming. But beneath his innocent exterior lay a darkness that no one in the town could have ever imagined. Timothy's arrival at the Caldwell farm was under tragic circumstances. After the death of his parents, he was sent to live with his uncle, Thomas Caldwell, and his aunt, Sarah. While they tried their best to care for him, little did they know that this seemingly harmless boy would soon become the epicenter of a series of inexplicable and horrific events that no one in the town could explain. The community was small, quiet, and close-knit. People knew each other's business. However, as soon as Timothy set foot in Sedalia, something unsettling began to happen. The first signs of trouble were subtle at first. A few strange accidents, some unexplained deaths, and a sense of unease that seemed to follow the boy wherever he went. People started to notice that Timothy's behavior was different. While other children played, Timothy worked relentlessly. He never showed signs of fatigue, never complained, and always appeared focused, almost too focused for someone his age. But it wasn't just the way he worked that troubled the people around him. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he interacted with others. It was as if he was observing them, studying them, like he was examining them through a lens no one else could see. And then, the first death occurred, an event that would spark a chain reaction of chilling events. Timothy had found young Mary Fletcher's body by the creek, but what struck everyone wasn't just the tragic nature of her death. It was the way Timothy described the scene with unsettling precision, as though he had witnessed it firsthand. That was just the beginning. What followed would be far darker, more sinister, and more impossible to explain than anyone could have ever imagined. Sedalia, Missouri, was a town still scarred by the wounds of the Civil War. In 1868, the town seemed to be stuck in time, a quiet farming community nestled in the heart of the Midwest. The remnants of the war were still fresh in the minds of the people. The once thriving town had seen its young men march off to distant battlefields, only to return in body bags or never return at all. Widows and orphans had become a familiar sight, and communities struggled to rebuild what had been lost. In the aftermath of such devastation, life in Sedalia was far from easy. The people of the town worked the land, planting crops and raising livestock, just as they had for generations. But there was a palpable sense of loss in the air. Sedalia was a place where neighbors knew each other's business, and there was a comfort in that familiarity, except for the Caldwell family. The Caldwell farm, just outside town, was an isolated homestead, far enough from Sedalia that the happenings there often went unnoticed by the townspeople. It was a family farm, but it had seen better days. James Caldwell, a proud Union soldier, had fought bravely in the war but was ultimately killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. His wife, Martha, struggled to keep the farm running in his absence, but illness took her in the winter of 1865, leaving their son, Thomas Caldwell, to inherit the land. But Thomas, only 21 years old, wasn't prepared for the weight of his inheritance. The farm was in debt, and he didn't have the resources or the know-how to keep it going. His wife, Sarah, was bitter and sharp-tongued, making their home life strained. They were a couple who had already endured much and weren't equipped to raise a child, especially not the child who would arrive at their doorstep in the spring of 1866. Thomas's brother, William, had died in the infamous Andersonville prison, leaving behind a widow and an 8-year-old son, Timothy. William's death became the catalyst that would forever change the course of Sedalia's future. Timothy had no family left. His mother had died, and his father, a soldier like his uncle, was lost in the war. His aunt and uncle, Thomas and Sarah, became his only remaining family. Timothy arrived on the Caldwell farm with nothing but a small cloth bag and eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Despite his small frame, his pale skin, and his unremarkable physical presence, There was something unsettling about him from the moment he stepped into the farm's faded front yard. The neighbors hardly noticed him at first, but as time passed, they began to see that there was something off about young Timothy Caldwell. Timothy Caldwell's arrival at the farm was a quiet affair. He came with little more than the clothes on his back and a small cloth bag, which he tightly clutched in his hands. The bag contained only a few belongings, trinkets and mementos from his late mother and father. For a boy so young, Timothy seemed remarkably composed, almost devoid of the typical fear and confusion one would expect from a child who had just lost both parents and been sent to live with strangers. His aunt, Sarah, and his uncle, Thomas, were not prepared for the burden of raising a child, especially one who came with so much loss. The farm had fallen into disrepair after James Caldwell's death, and Martha's illness had left the house cold and neglected. Yet Thomas and Sarah made the best of things, though their strained relationship was evident. Their home was quiet, save for the endless tasks that needed to be done on the farm. In many ways, it was a house filled with the ghosts of the past, ghosts that neither Thomas nor Sarah had learned to deal with in their own lives. Timothy, however, never seemed to mind the hardship. He never complained about the lack of warmth in the house, nor did he seem to care about the constant work that needed to be done on the farm. He simply accepted it all. It was as if the boy had no expectations, no sense of need beyond the basics. While other children would have longed for playtime, Timothy spent his days working alongside his uncle, quietly tending to the animals and the fields. But what struck the adults most was his silence. Timothy spoke very little, and when he did, it was always polite. "Yes, sir," "No, ma'am." But his voice was soft, measured, and devoid of the childish energy one would expect. The Caldwell farm was isolated from the town, and the few neighbors who lived nearby began to notice Timothy's odd behavior. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived next door, remarked to her husband, Samuel, that Timothy worked with an intensity that was unusual for a boy his age. He would toil from sunrise to sunset without stopping to rest or play, a behavior that seemed unnatural. There were no cries of joy, no laughter, no sense of innocence that typically accompanied children. Instead, Timothy worked with an eerie focus, moving from task to task without a moment's hesitation. But it wasn't just his work ethic that troubled the neighbors. There was something else about him, something in his eyes. His pale blue eyes seemed to stare into people, as if he was studying them, analyzing them. It was as though he was not only aware of his surroundings but also calculating, observing people and things with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. No one could quite place it, but there was something about Timothy that didn't fit. Dr. Samuel Harding, the local physician, was the first to truly take notice of the boy. When Timothy accompanied his uncle to town for supplies in June of 1866, Dr. Harding couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. While other children shy away from strangers, Timothy was calm, collected, and attentive. He answered questions directly, maintained steady eye contact, and displayed none of the fidgeting or nervousness that was typical of a child meeting a stranger. Harding later described it in his journal, writing that there was an unsettling quality about the boy, but he couldn't pinpoint what exactly disturbed him. It was a strange combination of politeness and coldness that seemed to define Timothy, an eerie detachment that left people unsure of how to interact with him. He was neither fearful nor playful, neither shy nor outgoing. In fact, he was almost too well-behaved for a child his age. In a way, it was as though Timothy was always observing, always thinking, but about what? And then, there was the way he seemed to be everywhere when strange events occurred. No one could explain how he was always in the right place at the right time, offering explanations for things that no child should have known. It was in those moments that the true mystery of Timothy Caldwell began to unfold. His calm demeanor, his eerie focus, and his unsettling presence would soon lead to the first death, the beginning of a chain of events that would leave the town of Sedalia forever changed. It was a hot afternoon in August 1866 when the first tragedy struck. Little Mary Fletcher, a 5-year-old girl from the town's blacksmith family, had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow stream that ran between several properties, including the Caldwell farm. Mary was known throughout the community for her bright laugh and her tendency to wander. On this particular day, She was near the creek, just outside the safety of her home, when tragedy struck. Timothy Caldwell was the one to find her. He arrived at the Fletcher house, drenched in sweat, with his usual calm demeanor, but his face was pale and his clothes were damp. His presence seemed oddly out of place, especially as the family was preparing for supper. But it wasn't the sight of him that bothered the Fletchers. It was what he said. "I found Mary by the creek," Timothy said, his voice steady despite his apparent agitation. "She's not breathing." The Fletcher family rushed to the creek, where they found Mary's lifeless body lying face down in the water. The creek, though shallow, had claimed her life. She had drowned, an event that, while tragic, was not entirely uncommon in rural areas where children played near water unsupervised. Dr. Samuel Harding was immediately summoned to the scene to confirm the cause of death. After a brief examination, he confirmed that Mary had indeed drowned. However, there was something about the whole situation that troubled Dr. Harding, and it wasn't just the death itself, it was Timothy's role in it. When questioned by the Fletchers and others, Timothy provided an unusually detailed description of the scene. He described exactly where Mary had been found, the position of her body, the condition of her clothes, and even the way the water around her face had been disturbed. What struck everyone as odd was the precision with which Timothy described the details. He could describe the exact placement of the deceased child's limbs, the way her dress had caught on a submerged branch, and even the color of the water surrounding her face. It was as if he had witnessed it all firsthand. When asked how he had happened upon the scene at that specific moment, Timothy explained that he had been searching for a lost calf. The boy's recall was remarkably precise. He described how the calf had gone missing that morning, and Thomas Caldwell confirmed that he had sent Timothy to search the creek area. However, the calf was found 2 days later, healthy and grazing nearly a mile from where Mary had drowned. The oddity of Timothy being the one to discover the body, despite no one else having seen him nearby, was becoming harder to ignore. At the funeral, Timothy sat quietly with his aunt and uncle, his head bowed respectfully throughout the service. To the casual observer, he appeared like any other grieving child. But to those paying close attention, there was something missing, something in his eyes. Timothy didn't cry. He didn't look distraught. In fact, there was a certain detachment in his demeanor that seemed completely out of place. When the Fletcher family expressed their gratitude to Timothy for finding their daughter, he accepted their thanks without so much as a hint of emotion. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he said, his voice carrying just the right tone of regret and sorrow. Yet, to Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who had been watching from across the room, Timothy's expression never changed. He sat there with a stillness that made her uneasy, his pale blue eyes cold and watchful. It was in that moment that the first seed of suspicion was planted. Timothy Caldwell had been involved in a death, but his behavior, so unervingly calm, so eerily detached, was unlike any child's response to such a tragedy. The town of Sedalia had just witnessed its first unexplained death, and the boy who discovered it was far from an ordinary child. The question now was, could this be the start of something much darker? As the days passed, the people of Sedalia began to notice more unsettling things about young Timothy Caldwell. It wasn't just his quiet demeanor or his peculiar habits. It was his strange and unnatural focus. While other children his age were out playing and socializing, Timothy seemed to have little interest in the carefree joys of childhood. Instead, he spent his time working, his face always set in an expression of determination, as though he were driven by a singular, unspoken purpose. The neighbors, who had initially thought little of his arrival, began to watch him more closely. They saw him working in the fields from dawn until dusk, never pausing to rest or play. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived next door, remarked to her husband that Timothy never seemed to tire, never stopped to eat or take a break, unlike any child she had ever known. He worked with a focus that made him seem more like a grown man than a boy. "It's like watching a little machine," she told her husband Samuel one evening at dinner. "He never stops, doesn't even seem to notice the heat or the sun, always working." But it wasn't just the relentless work ethic that caught their attention. There was something off about the way Timothy interacted with others. His manners were impeccable, always polite, always respectful. He never complained about his chores, even when they were particularly difficult, and he always followed orders without question. He would greet adults with a polite "yes, sir" or "no, ma'am," and it was clear that his uncle and aunt expected little more than that from him. Timothy's behavior was always in line with their expectations, but there was something unsettling about it. His politeness seemed calculated, as if he were mimicking the behavior he knew was expected of him. It was never genuine, never spontaneous. Even more unnerving was the way he seemed to study the people around him. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of the first to observe his peculiarities, noted that Timothy never seemed to look away when someone was speaking to him. His gaze was intense, unblinking, as though he were scrutinizing every word, every movement, trying to understand the inner workings of people. It wasn't a child's curiosity, it was something colder, something far more analytical. Dr. Samuel Harding, the local physician, had been observing Timothy for some time now. Though he had no definitive proof that there was something wrong with the boy, Harding couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. When Timothy first visited him in town with his uncle, Dr. Harding was struck by the boy's unusual composure. Unlike most children who were shy or fidgeted in the presence of strangers, Timothy sat still, answered questions calmly, and maintained eye contact in a way that was uncommon for someone his age. He had no nervousness, no hesitation, just a calm, unwavering gaze that made Harding uncomfortable. As Harding continued to observe him, he grew increasingly disturbed by Timothy's behavior. It was as though the boy was constantly watching, analyzing, and cataloging everything around him. It wasn't just a child's innocent curiosity. It was something more purposeful, more deliberate. He was watching people, learning from them, studying their every move with a level of precision that should not have been possible for a child. One particular incident stood out to Dr. Harding. On a routine visit to the Caldwell farm, Timothy had been present while Harding examined Thomas Caldwell for a back injury. As Harding checked the man's condition, Timothy stood off to the side, watching intently, his eyes never leaving Harding's hands as he worked. After the examination, Timothy asked questions about the human body, about anatomy, and about the ways in which injuries could affect people. His questions were specific, too specific for a child his age. "How do you know if someone is really dead?" Timothy asked, his voice casual, as though he were asking about the weather. "How can you tell if someone's really gone, or if they're just sleeping?" The question shocked Harding, who had seen his fair share of children, but none who asked about death with such clinical detachment. There was no fear in Timothy's tone, no wonder or curiosity typical of a child. Instead, it was as if he were already familiar with the subject in a way that was far too advanced for someone so young. Dr. Harding didn't answer Timothy's question directly. Instead, he changed the subject, but the boy's relentless interest in anatomy and the human condition only deepened. The more Harding thought about it, the more he was convinced that there was something deeply unsettling about Timothy's understanding of life and death. It was as though the boy had a fascination with mortality that went beyond the bounds of natural childhood curiosity. At the same time, Timothy's interactions with others remained polite but distant. He never formed the kind of emotional connections one would expect from a child. There was no genuine affection for his uncle and aunt, no real friendship with the local children. It was as if Timothy existed in a world of his own, where he was neither fully part of the community nor entirely detached from it. He was, in essence, an observer, always watching, always learning, but never truly connecting. This growing sense of unease about Timothy Caldwell was starting to spread throughout Sedalia. People could feel that something was wrong, but they couldn't put their finger on what it was. They couldn't explain the feeling, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. A feeling that something darker was taking root in their town. As the summer of 1866 wore on, the townspeople of Sedalia couldn't ignore the string of increasingly bizarre and tragic events that seemed to follow Timothy Caldwell wherever he went. The first death had been a shock, but when Mary Fletcher's body was discovered, the town had still clung to the hope that it was an isolated accident. However, in the weeks that followed, it became apparent that the town was being plagued by a wave of tragedies, each more puzzling than the last, and each connected in some way to young Timothy. The second death came just 3 weeks after Mary's. Henrik Len, an elderly Norwegian immigrant who had lived in Sedalia for years, was found dead at the bottom of a rocky outcrop known locally as Devil's Bluff. Henrik had been a logger before arthritis forced him into retirement, and the bluff was one of his favorite spots to visit. He had a reputation for knowing every trail in the area, and the thought that something could have happened to him while visiting a place he knew so well seemed impossible. It wasn't Timothy who discovered Henrik's body. It was a passing traveler who had noticed something odd at the base of the bluff. The traveler had spotted Henrik's hat, caught on a thorn bush near the cliff's edge, and went to investigate. What they found was a grim sight. Henrik's neck had been broken from what appeared to be a fall from the 40-foot cliff above. The question that immediately arose was how this had happened. Henrik was a man who knew the bluff like the back of his hand, and he had never shown any signs of losing his footing before. When Dr. Harding arrived to examine the body, the scene struck him as even more unusual. There were a number of dead bees scattered around Henrik's body, more than would be expected from a normal fall. Bees were known to nest in the area around the bluff, but the sheer number found near the body was odd. Even more puzzling was the lack of any sign that Henrik had disturbed a hive. It didn't make sense. If he had fallen while agitating the bees, there should have been evidence of the disturbance along his path to the bottom of the bluff, but there was none. The bees appeared to be concentrated solely around Henrik's body. When questioned, Timothy offered an explanation. "Maybe the old man was stung by the bees," he suggested nonchalantly. "He always said they got angry when you disturbed them." His suggestion seemed plausible at first, but as Harding climbed to the top of the bluff to investigate the beehives, he found them intact, showing no signs of recent disturbance. The bees were going about their business, collecting nectar from wildflowers, completely unbothered. Something didn't sit right with Dr. Harding. The scene didn't add up. There was no reason for Henrik to have fallen, no sign that he had been stung, and no evidence that the bees had swarmed him in the way Timothy suggested. It was almost as if the bees had been placed deliberately around the body, as if someone had planned the scene to look like a tragic accident. But there was no time to dwell on that thought. The third death came just weeks later, and this one would prove to be even more troubling. Jacob Mills, a 6-year-old boy from a nearby cabin, had been playing in the woods one afternoon when he vanished. His parents, frantic with worry, organized a search party. For days, the town scoured the nearby woods, looking for any sign of the boy. As the search grew more desperate, Timothy Caldwell volunteered to join the search. His endurance was uncanny. He walked tirelessly through the dense forest, leading the searchers through areas even the most experienced locals found difficult to navigate. He seemed to know the woods better than anyone else, and his knowledge of the terrain was unnerving. When asked how he had learned the paths so well, Timothy explained casually that he often explored the woods on his own, looking for plants and herbs that his Aunt Sarah could use for cooking and medicine. No one questioned him, though the story seemed odd. It was the kind of explanation that felt too rehearsed, too perfect. Why would an 8-year-old be so familiar with the woods? On the 4th day of the search, Timothy arrived at the Mills family cabin just before dawn. "I think I found something," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's an old well about a half-mile north of here. I heard something that sounded like crying." The search party rushed to the well, hidden by fallen logs and thick brush. To their horror, they found Jacob at the bottom of the well, barely conscious, his body dehydrated and weak. The boy had been trapped there for nearly 4 days, unable to escape. Though he was pulled from the well and rushed to Dr. Harding, Jacob was beyond help. His small body had been weakened by the exposure and the lack of water, and he died within hours. The most disturbing part of the entire ordeal, however, was how Timothy had found the boy. The well had been carefully concealed by natural debris, and it seemed nearly impossible that anyone could have found it by accident. Yet Timothy had located the well with an eerie certainty, as though he had known exactly where to look. Even more unsettling was Timothy's behavior in the days that followed. While the Mills family gathered at the cabin, Praying for Jacob's recovery, Timothy sat in the corner, quietly watching. Dr. Harding noticed that the boy wasn't crying or even appearing upset. There was no sign of grief, no expression of sorrow. Instead, Timothy seemed almost detached from the tragedy, as though he were a mere observer. Timothy's interest seemed focused on Jacob, but it wasn't the kind of curiosity a child would typically have for a sick or injured friend. Instead, Timothy observed Jacob with an intensity that made Dr. Harding uneasy. His eyes were fixated on the boy, his expression one of quiet analysis as he watched the child struggle for life. The combination of Timothy's unsettling behavior and his uncanny involvement in the deaths was becoming harder to ignore. As Dr. Harding continued to piece together the facts, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that surrounded the boy. These deaths, these tragic accidents, were beginning to look less like coincidences and more like something else entirely. Timothy was no longer just an innocent child who happened to be present during strange events. He seemed to be at the very center of these mysteries. The question was no longer if Timothy was involved, but how far his involvement went. And as Harding pondered that, the realization began to settle in. The boy wasn't just unlucky. He was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As the deaths continued to mount, Dr. Samuel Harding found himself increasingly disturbed by the events unfolding in Sedalia. While the town seemed content to attribute each death to bad luck or unfortunate accidents, Harding's medical training and years of experience told him something different. What was happening here was not the result of random misfortune. It was deliberate, and it was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The first signs that something was terribly wrong had been Timothy's behavior during the deaths. Dr. Harding had noted how the boy's presence seemed to be at the center of each tragedy. He wasn't simply an observer. He was involved, and his involvement was always marked by an unsettling calm. When young Mary Fletcher drowned in the creek, Timothy had appeared at the scene with precise details that seemed far beyond what a child could know. His discovery of Henrik Lenn's body had been similarly odd, especially considering the strange, unexplained presence of the dead bees around the man's body. And Jacob Mills. How had Timothy known where to find the well where the boy had been trapped for days? Harding had been unable to reconcile Timothy's behavior with that of a normal child, and the growing number of deaths in the area only deepened his suspicions. Dr. Harding knew that his instincts were right. There was something very wrong with Timothy, but he needed evidence, solid proof, that the boy was responsible for the deaths. The challenge, however, was proving it. Timothy had a remarkable ability to appear innocent. He was a model child by all outward appearances, well-mannered and obedient, and he showed no signs of guilt or remorse. Harding had seen enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, but in a small town like Sedalia, where the community held children in high regard and rarely questioned their innocence, his suspicions were difficult to voice aloud. In early October 1866, Harding made the decision to start observing Timothy more closely. Using his position as the town's physician, he began making regular visits to the Caldwell farm, ostensibly to check on the health of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell, who had both been suffering from ailments common to farmers. These visits provided Harding with the perfect opportunity to observe Timothy more closely, to see how he interacted with his aunt and uncle, and perhaps, just perhaps, to uncover something that would confirm his worst fears. During one of these visits, Timothy was present as Harding examined Thomas's back injury. The boy was always quiet during these exams, standing off to the side, watching intently. Harding began to feel more and more uncomfortable around Timothy. The boy's gaze was piercing, always fixed on Harding's hands as he worked, as if he were studying every movement, cataloging every detail of the procedure. After the examination, Timothy asked a series of questions that made Harding uneasy. "How do you know if someone is really dead?" he asked, his voice casual. "Sometimes they just look like they're sleeping." Harding was taken aback by the question. It wasn't just that Timothy was asking about death. It was the calmness with which he asked it, as though he had been thinking about the subject for a long time. Harding quickly dismissed the question, trying to steer the conversation away from such a disturbing topic. But Timothy wasn't finished. He continued to ask about anatomy, about injuries, about the human body, questions that seemed far too advanced for a child of his age. He asked about things that no child should be interested in, things that most adults would find uncomfortable to discuss. The questions were disquieting, but what bothered Harding more was how Timothy seemed to already know the answers. It was as if the boy had already studied the subjects he was inquiring about, as if he was already familiar with the darker aspects of life. The boy's curiosity wasn't rooted in the innocence of childhood. It was clinical, detached, and unervingly analytical. Over the next few weeks, Harding began to keep detailed notes about Timothy. He began to notice patterns in the boy's behavior, patterns that aligned with the strange deaths that had occurred around Sedalia. Timothy was always present, either near the scene of the accidents or directly involved in the events themselves. Harding began to wonder if Timothy's actions were more than just coincidence, if, in fact, they were deliberate. But what troubled Harding the most was the boy's reaction to the deaths. While the rest of the town mourned the loss of Mary, Henrik, and Jacob, Timothy showed no outward signs of grief. In fact, he showed no signs of emotion at all. His responses to the deaths were calculated, measured, as if he were simply observing the reactions of others rather than participating in the mourning process. At the funeral for Mary Fletcher, Timothy sat quietly with his aunt and uncle, his head bowed as if in sorrow, but Harding noticed that his eyes were dry, cold even, and his expression was as still and emotionless as ever. The more Harding observed Timothy, the more he became convinced that there was something fundamentally wrong with the boy. But without concrete evidence, Harding was helpless. He could document Timothy's odd behavior, but it was not enough to prove that the boy had been involved in the deaths. Yet, as the days went on, Harding began to realize that the town would never accept his suspicions without proof. He needed to find something that would link Timothy to the deaths directly, a piece of evidence that would expose the boy for what he truly was. Harding knew that he was walking a fine line. If he spoke out against Timothy without solid proof, he risked being dismissed as paranoid or hysterical. But if he was right, and if Timothy was truly responsible for the deaths, the stakes were much higher than a simple accusation. The safety of the entire community was at risk, and Harding was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Dr. Samuel Harding's worst fears came to a head in late October 1866, when he uncovered a discovery that would forever change his understanding of Timothy Caldwell. The boy, who had long been a source of unease, had now crossed a line that no one could have predicted. What had begun as strange coincidences and odd behaviors was now a fully realized horror. It was a routine visit to the Caldwell farm when Harding stumbled upon the first clue. He had gone to check on Sarah Caldwell, who had developed a persistent cough that Harding suspected was related to the harsh farm conditions. As he entered the farm's modest barn to find Sarah, he noticed something strange. Timothy was nowhere in sight. This was odd in itself, as the boy was rarely far from the farm, but it was the unusual silence in the barn that caught Harding's attention. Curious, Harding wandered further into the barn, hoping to find Sarah or Timothy. But it wasn't Sarah he found first. It was a sight that would haunt him forever. At the back of the barn, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, was a small, carefully constructed table, much too crude to be a piece of furniture intended for regular use. It was upon this table that Harding found the disturbing remnants of Timothy's dark activities. Timothy had been using the barn as a sort of laboratory, though it was a twisted kind of laboratory that no child should have even considered. Scattered across the table were the mutilated remains of various animals. Rabbits, squirrels, birds, and even a few larger creatures, all in various stages of dissection. What chilled Harding wasn't just the cruel treatment of the animals, but the careful manner in which they had been dissected. It was clear that Timothy had been performing experiments, observing the effects of injury and death on living beings. The animals were arranged methodically on the table, their bodies arranged in a way that suggested some kind of experiment, a twisted, clinical approach to suffering. The wounds inflicted on them were precise, purposeful. One small rabbit's eyes had been removed with such care that its body was undisturbed, save for the gaping hole in its skull. Beside the animal's body was a notebook, its pages filled with detailed notes in Timothy's unmistakable handwriting. The notes described the animal's reactions to injury, how long they stayed conscious, and the precise amount of time it took for their lives to end. Dr. Harding couldn't believe what he was seeing. There, before him, was the cold, scientific record of pain and suffering, of a child who was not only aware of these acts but was actively studying them with the dispassion of a trained scientist. The journal was meticulously kept, and it became apparent that this had been going on for months, perhaps longer. Each entry seemed to be more detailed than the last, as if Timothy was testing various methods to see how far he could push the creatures before they gave in to death. The next page of the journal was even more disturbing. Harding read the careful annotations detailing how long it took for the creatures to die once their eyes were removed or their limbs broken. There were even references to the screams and vocalizations of the animals, documenting the types of sounds they made as they suffered. The more Harding read, the more he realized that these were not the experiments of an innocent child. They were the deliberate, calculated actions of someone studying death, someone who was learning to control it. But the most chilling revelation came when Harding turned the page and found that, for the first time, the experiments had shifted. This time, the subject was not an animal, but a human. The drawings that followed were even more terrifying. Timothy had begun sketching human figures, just as he had done with the animals. There were crude, detailed drawings of people in various states of distress, children and adults alike, each image accompanied by notes about anatomy, injuries, and suffering. One of the sketches depicted Mary Fletcher, the first child to die, drowning in the creek. Another showed Henrik Len, his body broken after falling from the bluff. There was even a drawing of Jacob Mills, trapped at the bottom of the well, his face drawn in agonizing detail as he suffocated from dehydration. The most unsettling part of all was that these drawings were not just abstract representations. They were accurate, too accurate. They depicted injuries with an almost unnatural precision, suggesting that Timothy had been not only present during these deaths but had been directly involved in orchestrating them. The annotations beside each drawing made it clear that Timothy had been studying these events, taking notes, and learning from them. He wasn't just an observer of death. He was an architect of it. As Harding read on, he felt a sense of horror unlike anything he had ever experienced. Timothy was no longer just a strange, polite child who didn't fit in. He was a cold, calculating individual with a deep understanding of death and suffering. And he wasn't content to stop at animals. He had now set his sights on human beings, documenting their reactions to death as though they were nothing more than subjects in an experiment. The implications were too disturbing to ignore. Harding knew that Timothy was responsible for the deaths of Mary Fletcher, Henrik Len, and Jacob Mills. But now, Harding was confronted with a far greater question. Had Timothy planned these deaths from the beginning? Was he using the town and its people as part of a sick experiment to understand death and suffering? And if so, what would he do next? Dr. Harding's mind raced as he realized that the boy had not only escaped the notice of the townspeople, but had also managed to convince them of his innocence with his politeness and well-behaved demeanor. But now, Harding knew the truth. Timothy Caldwell was not just a strange boy. He was a monster, capable of orchestrating death with a level of precision that no one could have foreseen. And the town of Sedalia was now in grave danger. Dr. Samuel Harding's heart raced as he left the Caldwell farm that evening, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The evidence he had found, the drawings, the journal, and the chilling experiments, had confirmed what he had long suspected. Timothy Caldwell was no ordinary child. The boy wasn't just involved in the deaths of Sedalia's residents. He was orchestrating them with a cold, calculated precision. Timothy wasn't just studying death, he was creating it. Harding knew that his next step was crucial. He had to confront Timothy, expose him for what he was, and, more importantly, protect the town from any further harm. But he couldn't do it alone. Despite the evidence, Harding feared that the townspeople would dismiss his claims without proof. No one was prepared to believe that an 8-year-old boy could be capable of such monstrous acts. Even now, Harding could hardly accept it himself. But the truth was undeniable. Timothy had planned these deaths, and he was going to continue unless someone stopped him. The opportunity for that confrontation came sooner than Harding had anticipated. One afternoon, Dr. Harding visited the Caldwell farm to check on Thomas's worsening back injury. As he made his way toward the house, he noticed that there was an unsettling quiet in the air. There were no sounds of chickens clucking, no pigs grunting in the distance, and no sign of the usual farm activity. The stillness was unnatural, almost foreboding. As Harding approached the house, he was met by Timothy, standing at the door, staring at him with his usual intense, unblinking gaze. The boy was dressed in his usual work clothes, but there was something different about him today. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hands were scrubbed clean. Far too clean for someone who had been working on a farm. Harding noticed this, but his attention was drawn to Timothy's expression. There was something in his eyes, something not quite right. "Good afternoon, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice calm but oddly charged with anticipation. "I've been waiting for you." The words sent a chill through Harding. Waiting for me? He hadn't expected Timothy to say anything like that. The boy's tone was almost excited. It was as though he had been preparing for this moment. Harding's instincts told him that whatever was about to happen would be dangerous. "Where are Thomas and Sarah?" Harding asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "They're inside," Timothy replied, stepping aside to let Harding enter. But as Harding walked into the house, he immediately noticed something strange. Both Thomas and Sarah were in their bedroom, lying still in their beds. At first glance, they appeared to be sleeping, but Harding immediately sensed something was off. Their breathing was shallow, and their skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish pallor. "What happened to them?" Harding asked, turning to Timothy, who stood calmly in the doorway, watching him with those same unsettling eyes. "Oh, I gave them something," Timothy said nonchalantly. "Just some herbs I found in the woods. There are so many interesting plants out here. Some of them have very useful properties." His voice was so calm, so casual, as if he were discussing something completely harmless. Harding's pulse quickened as he moved closer to Thomas's bed, gently checking the man's pulse. It was weak but steady. Sarah was in a similar condition. Both had been drugged, likely with a substance that had rendered them unconscious but not dead. It was clear that Timothy's actions weren't accidental. He had planned this. "They're not going to wake up for several hours," Timothy continued, his voice almost sing-song. "That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption." The room seemed to close in on Harding as the boy's words sank in. There was a strange excitement in Timothy's tone, as though he were anticipating something. Harding realized that Timothy wasn't just trying to keep them asleep. He was setting the stage for something far darker. "What do you want to talk about?" Harding asked, his voice steady despite the rising sense of dread in his gut. Timothy's lips curled into a small smile. "I've been thinking about my experiments," he said, as if discussing a simple scientific study. "I've learned a lot from animals, but now I want to see what happens when people are involved. I want to see how you react when you know you're going to die." Harding froze. This wasn't just about experimenting anymore. Timothy was planning to kill them, and he wanted to see how they reacted. He wasn't content with simple death. He wanted to study the fear, the emotions, the desperate attempts to survive. Timothy stepped forward, his hands reaching for something behind the dresser. When he turned back to face Harding, he was holding a variety of tools: sharp knives, rope, and a heavy candlestick. He had prepared for this moment with chilling precision. "I want to see how you would act, Dr. Harding," Timothy continued, his voice low and full of unnerving excitement. "Would you try to protect yourself? Or would you try to save Thomas and Sarah? Will you fight, or will you surrender? I want to see if people are different when they know they're about to die." Dr. Harding realized, in that moment, that Timothy had already thought this all through. He had been preparing for this encounter, not just physically but psychologically. He had set the stage for a horrifying experiment, one where he would see how far a person could be pushed before they broke. "You've planned this, haven't you?" Harding asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You've been planning this for a long time." Timothy simply nodded. "Since I was 5, maybe earlier," he said. "It's fascinating, isn't it? Watching people suffer, seeing how they react when they think they're going to die." Harding knew that he had no time to waste. He had to act quickly. He had no idea how long it would take for Timothy to carry out his twisted plans, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't stop the boy now, there would be more deaths, more experiments. Without thinking, Harding reached into his medical bag, pulling out a pistol that he had kept hidden for protection. His hand trembled as he aimed it at Timothy. "Step away from the knives, Timothy," Harding said, his voice steady despite the fear racing through him. Now, for the first time, Timothy seemed to acknowledge the danger. He looked at the gun with a detached interest, as though he were examining an object rather than fearing it. "That's a Navy Colt, isn't it?" Timothy asked conversationally, as if discussing the weapon specifications rather than facing imminent danger. "How many bullets does it hold?" "6," Harding answered automatically, regretting it immediately. Timothy smiled. "And how many people are you trying to protect?" he asked, his eyes calculating the situation with disturbing accuracy. Harding knew then that he was up against more than just a boy. He was facing someone who understood human psychology better than anyone else, someone who could manipulate people with chilling ease. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Timothy was faster and more agile than Harding had anticipated, using the tools at his disposal with unnerving precision. But in the end, Harding was able to disarm him, pinning the boy down until Sheriff Crawford and his deputies arrived. As the dust settled, Timothy Caldwell sat quietly in the corner, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his pale blue eyes still gleaming with the same cold, calculating intelligence that had first disturbed Dr. Harding. "You can't prove anything," Timothy said softly, his voice almost calm, as though he were stating a simple fact. "Nobody will believe that a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford looked down at the boy with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "Maybe not," he said grimly, "but we don't have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your family is enough to see you locked up, regardless of your age." Timothy's expression softened into a smile, a real one this time. "You won't hang me," he said, as if speaking from experience. "I'm too young and too interesting. Someone will want to study me." It was clear, even in this moment of capture, that Timothy Caldwell would never stop. His mind was too twisted, too sharp, and too dangerous to ever be fully understood. The truth about Timothy Caldwell was that he had outgrown childhood long ago, and what lay beneath his innocent appearance was something far darker. The events that followed Timothy's capture were both swift and unsettling. Sheriff Crawford, who had witnessed Timothy's cold demeanor firsthand, was quick to have him restrained and brought to the town's jail. Despite his youth, Timothy showed no fear, no sign of panic. He walked into the cell with the same calm, calculating expression he always wore. His eyes, pale and unblinking, seemed to bore through anyone who dared to meet his gaze. He was as much a prisoner of his own mind as he was of the law. Word of Timothy's arrest spread quickly through Sedalia, and the town was thrown into an uneasy silence. The deaths of Mary Fletcher, Henrik Lenn, Jacob Mills, and others had shocked the community, but no one had dared to imagine that a child was behind it all. In the days following Timothy's capture, many of the townspeople still couldn't believe it. The idea of an innocent-looking boy being capable of such dark, calculated actions was too monstrous for them to accept. As for Dr. Harding, the burden of his discovery weighed heavily on him. While the truth had been uncovered, it did little to ease the horror he felt knowing that Timothy had been planning and executing these deaths for so long. Harding found himself haunted by the boy's complete lack of empathy, by his clinical detachment toward death and suffering. The investigation into Timothy's actions was slow but thorough. Sheriff Crawford, with the assistance of Dr. Harding, worked to piece together the full extent of the boy's involvement in the deaths. They carefully examined the journal Timothy had kept, the drawings and notes detailing the various deaths, the experiments on animals, and the chilling sketches of human beings in distress. Despite the evidence, the legal system faced a dilemma. Timothy, at only 8 years old, was too young to be tried as an adult. But the question remained, what to do with him? How could the justice system deal with a child who was clearly capable of horrific acts, yet whose age protected him from facing a proper trial? It was a question that left many in the town with more questions than answers. In the end, the solution was one that offered no real closure. Timothy Caldwell was sent to a reform school for children with psychological problems. The authorities believed he would be kept under strict supervision, that perhaps, over time, they could understand the extent of his mind and whether there was any hope for his rehabilitation. However, Dr. Harding could never shake the feeling that the system had failed Timothy and the town. He could never quite rid himself of the thought that the boy wasn't truly being locked away to be studied, but rather sent somewhere where his actions would be masked by clinical procedures and hidden behind closed doors. As for Sedalia, the scars of Timothy's presence remained long after his departure. Though life on the Caldwell farm resumed, the once quiet town could never quite forget what had happened. The faces of the families who lost loved ones, Mary, Henrik, Jacob, were still fresh in the minds of many. And though the boy who caused all the pain was locked away, the fear he had instilled in the community lingered like a shadow. Timothy Caldwell had been removed from the town, but his legacy of terror and unanswered questions would forever haunt Sedalia. In the years that followed Timothy Caldwell's capture, the town of Sedalia slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. But the shadow of his actions remained, lingering over the community like an unshakable fog. People spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, and the mystery of Timothy's true nature became a subject of endless speculation. Was he truly a psychopath, born without any capacity for empathy? Or was there something more to his story, something that had twisted him into the monster he had become? The official account, of course, was that Timothy had been sent to a reform school for children with severe psychological disorders. The authorities had hoped that through therapy and observation, they would be able to understand the boy's twisted mind and, if possible, attempt to rehabilitate him. But very little information came out of the facility. Over time, rumors spread that Timothy had been a subject of deep psychological study, examined by the best minds in psychiatry. Some whispered that he had been moved to a more secure facility, but no one could say for certain. There were those in Sedalia who believed that Timothy had been more than just a child with an evil streak. Some speculated that his actions were the result of a deeply traumatic childhood, one that had pushed him beyond the point of no return. Timothy had lost both of his parents at a young age and had been raised in a home where emotional connections were strained and distant. Could this emotional neglect have turned him into the cold, calculating individual he had become? Was he a product of his environment, or was there something more insidious at play? Dr. Samuel Harding, who had been the first to recognize the dangerous nature of Timothy's behavior, continued to question what had truly driven the boy to commit such horrific acts. Over the years, Harding became obsessed with Timothy's case. He began to examine other instances of children committing similarly violent acts, trying to find patterns or explanations that could help him understand what had happened to Timothy. But no matter how much research Harding conducted, he could never find a satisfactory answer. Some of the townspeople believed that Timothy's detachment from the world was a sign of a deeper mental illness, one that might never be fully understood. They claimed that Timothy had never been capable of feeling empathy, and that his experiments on animals and people were not acts of malice but rather an attempt to understand death itself. In their eyes, Timothy was a twisted genius, a child with a mind far beyond his years, but lacking the capacity for normal human emotions. Others in the community, however, saw Timothy's actions as a sign of something more terrifying. They believed that the boy was pure evil, a demon in the guise of a child. This theory was often whispered about in the darker corners of Sedalia, where people clung to the idea that some evil beings were simply born, rather than made. To them, Timothy's lack of emotion and his calmness in the face of violence suggested that he was not just a child with a psychological disorder, but something far darker, a force of nature that could not be stopped, no matter what precautions were taken. There were also those who wondered if Timothy's true nature had been hidden all along. Some speculated that he had learned to manipulate those around him, that he had carefully crafted his persona as a polite, well-behaved child in order to gain the trust of his aunt and uncle, the community, and even Dr. Harding himself. His calculated behavior seemed too perfect to be the result of mere instinct. Was it possible that Timothy had intentionally made himself appear harmless, only to reveal his true self when the time was right? In the years following his capture, there was talk of Timothy's potential release. Though he was still a child, some felt that he had served his time and deserved a second chance. Others, however, believed that he was beyond redemption, that his actions were so monstrous that he could never be trusted again. The idea of Timothy Caldwell returning to society was a deeply divisive one, and as the years went on, more and more people began to distance themselves from the boy's legacy. As the town of Sedalia moved forward, the questions surrounding Timothy's true nature remained unanswered. Theories about his past, his motivations, and his ultimate fate continued to circulate, but no one could say for certain what had truly happened to him. Was he a product of his upbringing, a victim of his circumstances, or was he something far more sinister? Could he ever be rehabilitated, or was his capacity for violence a part of him that could never be erased? For now, Timothy's fate remained a mystery, locked away in a facility where only a select few knew the truth. But for the people of Sedalia, the question would always linger. What really happened to Timothy Caldwell? As we come to the end of tonight's chilling tale, one question still lingers in the air. What makes someone like Timothy Caldwell? Was he born this way, or was he shaped by the world around him? We may never know the full truth behind Timothy's terrifying actions, but one thing is certain. His legacy has left an indelible mark on the town of Sedalia, and on all of us who've dared to explore his story. But what do you think? Was Timothy simply a victim of circumstances, or was he a product of something darker? Could he have been stopped before it was too late, or was his path toward violence inevitable from the start? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below and let us know what you think about Timothy's case. Do you believe some children are born evil, or is it something they learn over time? And if you think you know the answer, don't forget to share this video with your friends. Maybe they have their own theories to add to the discussion. If you're enjoying these true crime stories and mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chilling tale. Like and share this video with fellow mystery enthusiasts, and join our community as we continue to uncover the darkest stories history has to offer. Remember, the truth is often stranger and far darker than we can imagine. Stay tuned for more, and as always, thank you for your support. We'll see you in the next story, where the shadows are never too far behind.